To honor a dead friend's will, he married the woman he'd never met. She was nothing like he feared. The August sun hung low over Blessing Creek. Caleb Whitaker stood alone outside Morrison's Mercantile, one hand resting on the hitching post, the other tucked into his vest pocket where his father's old pocket watch ticked with quiet persistence. He checked the time again, 3:27. The coach was late. Or maybe it was just that time had taken to stretching itself in the final minutes before everything changed. It had been 47 days since Elias Callahan died in Caleb's arms, taken by a prairie rattler just south of the grazing fence. 47 days since Elias, half delirious from venom, had gripped Caleb's bloodied sleeve and whispered with urgent clarity, "You must take care of her. Promise me, Caleb, she's already on her way." He hadn't spoken her name, but the letter in Elias's will had filled in the rest. Margaret Callahan, his intended, his bride by correspondence. Caleb had never met her. Now, with the town's quiet hum surrounding him, hammering from the blacksmith's shop, children's laughter from behind the church, the slow swing of the saloon doors behind him, Caleb stood bracing against a future that had arrived before he was ready to meet it. He glanced down the road for the third time in as many minutes, then turned his gaze toward the simple wooden cross nailed crookedly atop the whitewashed chapel across the square. The church hadn't hosted a wedding in over a year. Reverend Harlan said he'd dust off his vestments, and a handful of townsfolk had offered to stand witness. Not out of charity, Caleb figured, but curiosity. Word of Elias's unusual bequest had traveled faster than wildfire in a dry wind. What sort of woman agreed to marry a man by post? And what sort of man fulfilled a promise like this? He swallowed the question as the far-off rattle of wheels stirred the stillness. The coach was coming, and so was the woman he was bound to marry. The creak of leather harnesses and the rhythmic slap of hooves pulled Caleb from his thoughts. Dust billowed at the edge of town, announcing the coach before it came into full view. Folks had begun to gather discreetly. Mrs. Turner from the boarding house shaded her eyes with a gloved hand, and young Peter Foster leaned out from the barber's porch with a half-lathered gin, too curious to finish his shave. Even the stray dogs had taken up posts in the shade, watching. Caleb squared his shoulders, tugged down the brim of his hat, and walked slowly toward the depot. He hadn't dressed for a wedding exactly, just clean trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a leather vest darkened with years of weather and work. A man didn't need a cravat to keep his word. The stage pulled to a stop with a dusty sigh. The driver, lanky Luther Bell, tipped his hat toward Caleb. "Afternoon, Whitaker. Got something for you. Long way from Boston, I hear." Caleb nodded, but his reply stuck somewhere behind the knot forming in his throat. The door opened, and a traveling salesman disembarked Hearst, followed by a woman wrapped in layers of lace and indignation, likely returning from a visit to relatives back east. Then came a gloved hand, steady and deliberate, gripping the frame. Margaret Callahan stepped down, not with hesitation, but with purpose. She wore a dark green traveling gown that suited the dust-stained road about as well as pearls in a cattle pen, but she carried herself with such quiet self-possession that Caleb could only stare. Her auburn hair was pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and her eyes, green, discerning, scanned the town not with alarm but with calculation. Not the desperate spinster he'd envisioned, not the porcelain bride needing rescue. A woman used to making decisions. Their eyes met, and though she didn't smile, she inclined her head with practiced courtesy. "Mr. Whitaker?" Her voice carried a soft Irish lilt, tempered by education and restraint. "I believe you were expecting me." Caleb removed his hat and nodded. "Miss Callahan, I'm sorry for your loss." She dipped her chin. "Thank you. I imagine there's much we need to discuss." There was, but nothing he'd rehearsed quite fit the moment. "I'd offer you a seat," Caleb said, nodding toward the depot bench, "but I imagine you'd prefer we speak somewhere out of earshot." Margaret's gaze swept the gathered onlookers, more now and less subtle. Small towns had long memories and short distances between whispers. "I would, yes," she replied simply. Caleb led her across the street to Morrison's Mercantile, tipping his hat at Doc Willoughby, who was watching from the shade with crossed arms and raised brows. Inside, Mr. Morrison gave a single nod of acknowledgment and gestured them toward the back room, a cluttered space that smelled of coffee, gun oil, and paper ledgers. Margaret took the only chair. Caleb remained standing, uncertain whether to remove his vest or his defenses first. "My condolences," she began. "Elias spoke of you often. He wrote that you were the most honorable man he'd ever known." It wasn't a compliment Caleb felt ready to claim. "He saved my life more than once," he said, voice quiet. "When he asked me to see to your well-being, I gave my word." "I respect that." She folded her gloves neatly on her lap. "But I didn't come here looking for a guardian." Caleb nodded slowly. "And I didn't expect a woman who looked me straight in the eye like she already knew what kind of man I am." A corner of her mouth quirked, barely. "You assume too much." "Don't we both?" They sat in silence for a beat, the ticking of the store's wall clock filling the space between expectations. "I suppose the Reverend's waiting," Caleb said. "He is," she confirmed. "But before I agree to anything, I need to understand one thing." Caleb braced. "Are you entering this marriage out of duty alone, or are you at least open to the possibility that it might become something real?" He exhaled, slow and unguarded. "I can't promise affection, but I can promise effort and respect. You won't be beholden to me in any way you don't choose." Margaret studied him for a moment longer. "Then I suggest we speak our vows with clarity," she said, "and live by them just the same." Can you guess what's about to happen? Leave your prediction in the comments. Like the video to motivate me to make the next videos. The chapel at Blessing Creek stood at the far edge of town, its white clapboard walls weathered by decades of prairie wind and summer heat. A single wooden cross, crooked but resolute, crowned the steeple. Inside, the pews had been dusted that morning, the scent of linseed oil still lingering in the air. It wasn't grand, but it held history, of weddings, burials, and sermons that stitched together a community trying to carve permanence into unsettled ground. Margaret walked beside Caleb, her steps even, her expression unreadable. She dressed in her simplest traveling gown again, dark green wool with no embellishment, save for the brooch at her collar, a small silver cross etched with the words "Fiat voluntas tua," "Let thy will be done." Reverend Harlan waited at the front of the chapel. He was a wiry man with sunburned skin and eyes that had seen more death than most preachers were trained for. A former chaplain from the war, he conducted his duties with the same quiet gravity he once brought to battlefield prayers. The ceremony was short, simple, no music, no grand procession, just two people standing before God and half the town, saying words they both knew could shape or shatter everything to come. Margaret handed the Reverend a narrow gold ring, worn smooth by time. "My mother's," she said, almost too softly to be heard. She wore it through every hardship Boston could throw at her. Caleb took it with reverence. When he slid it onto her finger, his hands were steady, though his heart wasn't. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Harlan said with a nod. Caleb hesitated, then leaned forward to press a brief kiss to Margaret's cheek. Her skin was cool and calm, her reaction measured, no tremble, no retreat, just quiet acknowledgement. Outside, the town offered polite applause, more curious than celebratory. Mrs. Turner from the boarding house handed Margaret a wrapped bundle. "Biscuits and preserves for the ride," she said, eyes kind if cautious. "I booked a room in town for the night," Margaret said quietly once the crowd dispersed. "Didn't seem practical to ride out this afternoon." Caleb nodded. "I'll stable my horse. We can talk about tomorrow." Neither of them said the word honeymoon. That wasn't the kind of story they were living. Not yet. The bridal suite at Blessing Creek's boarding house smelled faintly of rosewater and linseed oil. Martha Kowalski, its Polish proprietor, had prepared the room with what she likely considered festive care. Fresh linens on the wide bed, a vase of prairie wildflowers on the washstand, and 2 candles placed side by side at the windowsill. Their flames wavered in the dusk, softening the room's edges, though nothing could quite dissolve the tension between its new occupants. Margaret set her satchel down by the dresser and unpinned her bonnet. Caleb stood just inside the doorway, hat still in hand, his boots unmoving on the threshold. "I can take the stable," he offered, not unkindly. Margaret turned to look at him, one brow raised. "And give Mrs. Kowalski more to gossip about than she already has? The groom too spooked to share a roof with his bride?" His mouth twitched, almost a smile, but he didn't step further into the room. "I meant no insult," he said. "I know." She unfastened the top buttons of her dress and moved to the washstand, pouring water from the pitcher into the basin. "You can have the bed. I'll sleep by the hearth." "That's not necessary." She glanced over her shoulder, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "I'm not trying to prove anything, Mr. Whitaker, but neither of us is ready to play husband and wife. We made a practical agreement. Let's honor that." He hesitated, then gave a slight nod and set his hat on the chair. As Margaret rolled out a wool blanket and arranged it on the floor by the window, Caleb watched her in silence. She moved with economy, not grace, but not awkwardness either. A woman used to adapting, not complaining. Her dress was plain, her figure unremarkable, yet something in her composure unsettled him. Not beauty, but assurance. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, not looking up. He blinked, caught off guard. "What do you want to know? What will I need to manage? What's expected of me?" Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's a 2,000-acre spread, mostly cattle. House is solid, 3 bedrooms, good kitchen. There's a garden, though it's gone wild since Elias got sick. We have 4 hands. Miguel runs the crew, and his wife Elena cooks. They've been with us 8 years. Margaret nodded slowly. "And you expect me to take over the domestic side?" "I expect nothing," he said. "But you'd be welcome to do what you're willing. Elias said you were capable. I believe him." A pause. "Did he write to you often?" she asked. Caleb looked down at his hands. "Not as much as he should have, but when he did, he spoke well of you." That was almost true. Elias hadn't spoken much of Margaret at all, but he had trusted her, and in Caleb's world, trust was worth more than sentiment. Margaret blew out the first candle, then the second. "We'll see how well we suit." In the quiet that followed, Caleb lay back on the mattress, fully clothed, boots off, but ready to rise. Margaret settled on her pallet near the window, arms folded beneath her head. Outside, the town settled into its nighttime hum. Distant voices, the creak of wood cooling in the night air, and the faint chime of the chapel bell. Inside, 2 strangers shared a room, a marriage, and the unspoken hope that duty might, someday, give way to something warmer. By dawn, the boarding house kitchen was already warm with the scent of frying eggs and yeast bread. Margaret ate in silence, her mind turning over logistics, what she would need to organize, what was worth observing before suggesting change. She dressed in a practical wool skirt and bodice, her boots freshly polished, her auburn hair braided and pinned neatly beneath a soft brown bonnet. Caleb met her at the door, already saddled and ready. Instead of horseback, a 2-wheeled wagon waited, packed with her trunk, 2 crates of provisions, and a few tools strapped down with care. "I figured it'd be easier than riding," he said, nodding to the wagon. "That was thoughtful," she replied, and she meant it. They rode in companionable quiet for a stretch, the early morning sun gilding the grasslands in amber light. The land opened wide on either side of the trail, endless golds and soft browns broken only by a scattering of cottonwoods and the occasional fence line. Margaret studied the terrain with an eye trained for detail, not wonder. She saw the subtle dips that might collect water, the patches of bare earth that hinted at overgrazing. "You've got good pasture land," she said finally. "How's your water?" Caleb glanced at her, then back to the trail. 3 natural springs, 2 reliable through summer. We dug a well last year, deep, but it holds. Margaret nodded, filing that away. "And winter?" "Harsh," he said. "Snow comes early, leaves late. But the house is built solid. Plenty of firewood. We're used to it." "You and Elias built it together?" He hesitated. "Mostly Elias. I was still working cattle back then, but I helped with the stonework." It wasn't just stonework she was interested in, and he knew it, but Margaret didn't press. Instead, she asked about the hands, the layout, the supplies. Caleb answered with a quiet precision that suggested he'd expected to be questioned. "But not quite like this. You don't talk like someone who's new to ranching," he said at one point. "My father managed stables in Boston," she replied, "and I grew up reading farm ledgers for fun. Arithmetic was easier than grief." He looked at her then, really looked, and caught the faintest shift behind her steady voice. Loss, not dwelled on, but still present. Not fragile, simply part of her. By mid-morning, they crested a low ridge, and the ranch came into view. The main house stood proud at the center, its stone chimney puffing lazy smoke. A corral stretched to one side, dotted with horses. Barns and sheds clustered near the creek, and rows of fence line marked out grazing areas. Margaret leaned forward slightly, taking it all in. "It's bigger than I expected." "It'll feel smaller in winter," he said, "when you're snowed in and can't see the fence line." "I don't mind snow," she said. "I mind stagnation." Caleb glanced at her again, and this time his lips curved slightly. Not quite a smile, but something softened. At the front steps, Miguel Santos stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Compact and weathered, he moved with the confidence of a man who knew the land well. "Welcome home, Mrs. Whitaker," he said, removing his hat. Margaret returned the gesture. "Thank you, Mr. Santos. I look forward to learning from you." And Caleb, standing just behind her, realized she meant it. Not as flattery, not as performance, but as fact. The front room of the Whitaker house bore the unmistakable imprint of masculine solitude. Heavy wood furniture, practical but worn. A stone hearth stacked with firewood. A rifle resting in plain sight near the window. It smelled faintly of tobacco, cured leather, and ash from seasons past. Margaret stood just inside the threshold, neither overwhelmed nor unimpressed. This wasn't a space that needed softening, it needed direction. Elena Santos greeted her with flour-dusted hands and a warm smile. Petite, dark-haired, and quick-moving, Elena radiated the kind of strength that came not from loudness, but from long years of doing everything that needed doing. "Senora," Elena said, then quickly corrected herself. "Mrs. Whitaker, we are happy you are here." Margaret offered her hand. "Please, call me Margaret. If we're to share a kitchen, we ought to speak plainly." Elena's eyes brightened. "Yes, that is good." By mid-morning, Margaret had unpacked her trunk, swept the bedroom floor, and assessed the pantry. There were shelves of dry goods and root vegetables, a row of preserves dated 2 summers ago, and an entire cabinet of tools misplaced, repurposed, or broken. Nothing chaotic, but nothing efficient either. She didn't criticize, she noted. Later, when Elena brought a pot of black coffee to the table, Margaret joined her without waiting for an invitation. "You've managed a great deal alone," Margaret said, not as flattery, but fact. "I can't promise miracles, but I do understand order." Elena smiled, but then her face turned cautious. "Senor Caleb, he is kind, but he is, how you say, used to silence." Margaret sipped the bitter brew, then nodded. "I'm not here to rearrange his world, just find space to live in it." That seemed to satisfy Elena. From the window, they watched as Miguel and Caleb worked with the hands to repair a section of corral fencing. The men moved with quiet coordination, boots kicking up dust, shirts damp with sweat. Margaret noticed how Caleb's sleeves were rolled high, exposing forearms marked by years of labor, his hat low over his brow. A capable man, a cautious one. Elena tilted her head. He was different before Elias died, not louder, but lighter. Margaret didn't respond. She didn't know the old Caleb, only the one who had met her gaze without pity or presumption. That night, supper was a quiet affair. Roast chicken, boiled potatoes, and cornbread made golden with fresh butter. The ranch hands ate quickly and gratefully, offering polite nods when introduced to Margaret. She asked no questions of them, offered no opinions. She simply passed the bread, thanked them for their work, and listened. Later, alone in the bedroom Caleb had offered as hers, Margaret unpacked the last item from her trunk, a leather-bound journal, the edges worn smooth. She sat at the desk by the window, opened to a blank page, and wrote. Day 1. No one here expects kindness, but neither do they resist it. That, I think, is a place to begin. Downstairs, Caleb stoked the hearth in the front room, unaware of the lines she'd written, but somehow aware that something in the air had shifted. Not in words, but in rhythm. It was Martha Kowalski who planted the seed. She arrived late in the morning, aprons still dusted with flour, a small bundle of mail in one hand and a tin of preserved cherries in the other. "Consider it a welcome," she said, setting the tin on the kitchen table where Margaret was organizing shelves by expiration date. "And a little gossip, if you'll indulge me." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Gossip?" Martha grinned. "The school board's been in knots since Miss Delaney married that widower in Cheyenne and abandoned her post. The children have been running wild for months. Caleb mentioned you were a teacher." Margaret glanced toward the open window, where Caleb and Miguel were checking the stockpile of firewood. "He mentioned that?" Martha poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into a chair. "Said you might want purpose beyond mending socks, and we could use you. 20-some children, ages 6 to 15. The schoolhouse is standing, but just barely." Margaret turned the idea over in her mind as she wiped her hands on a towel. Her last classroom had been a narrow room above a grocer's shop in Boston, where parents whispered behind cupped hands when her father's debts made headlines. Here there were no headlines, just hungry minds and parents too worn down to judge. "I'd need chalk, slates, ledgers." "We still have some," Martha said quickly. "I saved what Miss Delaney left. And the school board can scrape up $30 a month. Not much, but steady." Margaret hesitated. Would the children's parents accept a woman like me, a stranger? Martha studied her with a look Margaret had come to recognize, a mixture of surprise, skepticism, and cautious hope. "They'll accept results, and from what I gather, you deliver." That evening, Margaret brought the idea to Caleb over supper. "They're offering me a teaching post," she said as she passed him the potatoes. "Mondays through Fridays, mornings only to start." He paused mid-reach, then set the spoon down. "Do you want it?" "I do," she said. "I want to be useful in more than one way." He nodded. "Then take it. The ranch can survive without you during school hours." Margaret offered a small smile. "I wasn't asking permission, Caleb. I was informing my partner." That gave him pause, and then, to her quiet satisfaction, he nodded again, a deeper one this time, a real one. The schoolhouse stood at the eastern edge of Blessing Creek, a one-room structure weathered by time and prairie storms. Its paint had peeled in long, curling strips, and a crack in the west-facing window let in wind more often than light. But the bell still rang when Margaret pulled its rope, and that, more than anything, told her the building still had a heartbeat. On her first day, 15 children showed up. By the end of the week, there were 23. She began with order, assigning seats by age and skill, hanging slates where walls would take nails, and creating a morning ritual of psalm recitation and mental arithmetic. Not because she was religious by habit, but because children needed rhythm before they could absorb content. The youngest students, barefoot, curious, and distracted, responded to her calm tone and structured expectations. The older ones, especially the boys who'd grown unruly during the long teacherless months, tested her at first. But when she calmly sent one of them, Eli Taylor, outside to stack firewood instead of embarrassing him, they understood she meant business. Not punishment, just consequence. On Thursday afternoon, Carlos Santos rode by on his lunch break to bring a message from Elena. "My daughter Maria," he said in careful English, hat held respectfully to his chest, she wants books, but she is shy, afraid of classroom." Margaret didn't flinch. "Does she read in Spanish?" "Yes, very well." She smiled. "Leave that to me." The next day, a beginner's English reader appeared, unobtrusively, on the Santos porch, tucked beside a basket of eggs. Margaret didn't say a word. Neither did Maria. But 2 days later, the girl stood just outside the classroom window, listening. By the second week, she stepped inside. Meanwhile, Caleb remained mostly quiet about her work. He asked no probing questions. He offered no praise. But he did begin picking her up from school in the wagon without being asked, so she wouldn't have to walk the mile home alone. And one evening, after supper, he lingered by the doorway as she graded spelling lists. "You had a full house today," he said. "I did." "They're talking about you in town." "What kind of talk?" "Good kind," he replied. "Respectful." She considered that for a moment. Then, "It's a start." He nodded and turned to go, but before he reached the stairs, he added, "The Santos girl, Maria, she's been smiling more." Margaret looked up. "Thank you," he said, simply. That night, as she returned to her journal, she wrote only one line. "Respect comes slow, but once it roots, it grows deep." If you like this video, comment number 1. If you don't, comment number 2. Please subscribe to the channel to watch more videos and give me more motivation to collect and share other stories. The first frost came overnight, settling in delicate lace across the barn roof and fencing rails. Morning chores began with breath visible in the air and stiff fingers wrestling with frozen latches. But inside the Whitaker house, warmth bloomed from both the hearth and the growing rhythm of life. Margaret had taken over the pantry and root cellar with quiet efficiency. Caleb hadn't asked her to, but he noticed the way supplies were now labeled in clear, practiced script: flour, cornmeal, dried beans, all neat as a classroom shelf. There were fewer misplaced tools, fewer shouted questions about where something had gone. That evening, Caleb returned from repairing the fence line with Miguel to find the table already set. Nothing fancy, but enough care in the way the bread was wrapped in linen and the stew held warm beside the fire to make him pause. Margaret was at the desk by the window, bent over lesson plans by lamplight. "You still working?" he asked, not quite interrupting. She looked up and pushed her spectacles higher on her nose. "Always, but I can stop for stew." They sat together in a quiet that had grown companionable, neither forced nor brittle. Caleb wasn't a man of many words, but he found himself asking about her students, the condition of the schoolhouse roof, even which books she missed most from Boston. Margaret answered with her usual clarity, but there was something new in her voice, an ease that hadn't been there weeks ago. Not warmth, not yet, but peace. After the dishes were washed, Margaret stepped onto the porch with a shawl wrapped tight across her shoulders. Caleb joined her, shrugging on his coat, and they stood in silence, watching the sky shift from indigo to coal. Stars blinked into view, scattered across the horizon like promises not yet spoken. "Have you considered horses?" she asked suddenly. He blinked. "We have a few." Not just for ranch work, she clarified. You've got strong stock. If trained properly, you could sell to the army. Cavalry units pay well, and breeding them would require less pasture than cattle. Caleb turned toward her. You've been thinking about that? I think about everything, she said simply. It's how I sleep at night. And then, after a pause, you're not the only one trying to build something out of what was left behind. He looked at her for a long moment, no longer just seeing a woman honoring a contract, but a mind and soul aligning beside his own. He didn't say anything, but he didn't need to. Not yet. The wind changed on a Thursday. By noon, Caleb had noticed the shift in the way the chickens huddled near the coop and how the horses kept glancing east, ears twitching. The air grew heavier, the sky tinged with a yellow-gray hue that promised snow before sundown. Not a dusting, something deeper, a storm that could close the ranch in for days. Without needing to be told, Margaret moved through the house like someone trained for battle, not chaos. She and Elena secured the shutters, packed extra blankets into the bedrooms, and brought in jars of pickled carrots and dried apples from the root cellar. Margaret checked the oil levels in the lamps, counted matches, and swept the hearth clean of ash from the previous night. Caleb caught her setting a kettle to boil and paused in the doorway. "You've done this before?" Her answer came without hesitation. "No, but I've prepared for worse with less." There was no fear in her face, just clarity. He admired that, had been admiring it for weeks without naming it. Watching her command space without demanding attention, watching her assess people without underestimating them, it stirred something in him he wasn't used to. Not desire, not yet, but comfort, trust. By early evening, flurries had become a curtain of white, and the ranch fell under the hush that only deep snow could bring. The cattle had been moved to the lower pasture, the hens tucked in tight. Miguel and the hens had hunkered down in the bunkhouse, grateful for the early warning. Inside, the lamps flickered, casting soft light over the parlor. Margaret sat knitting by the hearth, her shoulders relaxed, the shawl from her mother wrapped snug around her. Caleb poured 2 mugs of coffee and offered her one without a word. She accepted, her fingers brushing his briefly, cold to the touch but steady. "Thank you," she said. Then, after a pause, "You always notice what needs doing, don't you?" He shrugged. "Not always in time." Margaret smiled, small but real. "Then we're alike." That struck him quiet, because she was right. They were alike, in the ways that mattered. Not loud, not showy, but constant, reliable. The kind of people storms didn't scare, because storms had shaped them. As the wind howled against the window and the house settled into its quiet vigil, Caleb found himself watching her instead of the fire. And for the first time, he didn't see a duty. He saw a woman he was beginning to need. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a white world, muffled and shining under a sky scraped clean by wind. The front door groaned as Caleb pushed it open, revealing a snowdrift halfway up the porch rail. He paused, taking it in, the stillness, the raw brightness of it all. Margaret stepped beside him, her breath fogging the air. She wore her coat buttoned high, a knitted cap pulled low over her ears, and gloves already dusted with snow from checking on the woodpile earlier. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes alert. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Could be worse," he replied. "We'll need to dig paths to the barn and the bunkhouse, the henhouse too." She nodded, already stepping into her boots. "I'll take the coop." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" She turned, halfway down the porch steps, shovel in hand. "I didn't come here to sit by the fire while others work." There was no pride in her tone, just principle. They worked side by side for hours, carving paths through thick snow, checking livestock, hauling hay. At one point, Miguel shouted something in Spanish from the barn, and Margaret responded in kind, fluent, precise, with the ease of someone who had bothered to learn more than words. Caleb stopped for a moment, leaning on his shovel, watching her help Carlos guide a nervous colt back into the stable. She moved with a quiet certainty, her hands steady, her voice calm. It wasn't just that she belonged here, it was that she made the place more whole. Later, as they returned to the house for a midday meal, Margaret reached up and brushed snow from Caleb's collar, not thinking, just acting. Her hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. He didn't step back. Inside, Elena had prepared hot broth and cornbread, and the three of them ate in companionable silence. Afterward, Caleb and Margaret stood again on the porch, watching the world thaw by degrees. "You're good at this," he said suddenly. She looked over, brow raised. At what? This life, this place, these people. She didn't answer right away. Then, "It feels like something I could build into." Caleb nodded, a breath caught in his chest. "That's what it feels like for me, too." They didn't say more, but the air between them changed, no longer just respectful. Now it was charged with something waiting, something ready. The snow kept them inside for most of the next day. Outside, the world was still hushed, but inside the Whitaker home, the fire cracked steady and warm. Caleb returned from the barn mid-afternoon, his shoulders dusted with frost, boots thudding softly against the floorboards. Margaret was in the parlor, seated by the hearth, a book open in her lap. When he entered, she looked up. "You're back early." He hung his coat. "Horses are fed, fences are holding." She nodded and went back to her book. He didn't leave. Instead, he crossed to the opposite chair and sat, elbows on his knees. "What are you reading?" She showed him the spine. "Ivanhoe." It was in the schoolhouse cupboard. Not my favorite, but I couldn't resist a familiar friend. He nodded, eyes on the flames. Elias liked stories like that, knights and quests. Margaret turned a page. "You didn't?" "I liked stories where the people weren't born heroes, just became them, because they had to." He said it quietly, more to the fire than to her. She closed the book softly. "Do you ever feel like you're still in the middle of becoming?" Caleb looked up. "Sometimes I wonder if that ever ends," he said. Margaret studied him, how his hands were always slightly rough, how his voice grew softer when talking about things that mattered. "You've done a lot with this place," she said, "but you never talk about what you want for it." He exhaled. "I used to think survival was enough. Keep the cattle alive, pay the bills, keep my word." She didn't speak, just waited. "But lately," he paused, "I wonder what it would feel like to build someone with someone who sees what you see, someone who plans with you, who wants roots, not just walls." Margaret's hands were still folded in her lap, but her fingers tightened slightly. "That sounds like more than duty, Caleb." "It is," he said. "It's starting to be." The fire snapped sharply, sending sparks up the chimney. When he finally looked over at her, there was nothing guarded in his face. "I don't know how to say it well, but this, us, it doesn't feel like an arrangement anymore. It feels like a beginning." Margaret's eyes softened. Her voice came low. "That's all I ever needed. A beginning. And a man who saw me not as a burden or a bargain." He leaned back in his chair, breath slow. Then, "You're neither." The next morning dawned quiet and cold, with frost curling across the window panes like lace. The hearth had gone to embers overnight, but the room still held warmth. From the fire, yes, but also from the memory of the words shared the night before. Margaret had risen early, drawn not by duty, but by something deeper, by a pull she couldn't quite name, except that it felt like belonging. Caleb joined her at the table after feeding the horses. He smelled faintly of hay and leather, and his collar was still damp from the fog. On the table lay 2 maps, one of the ranch, one broader, the region's new rail lines, sketched in ink and dated 4 months ago. "You've been thinking about expansion," Margaret said as she ran her fingers along the penciled fence lines. "I have," Caleb admitted, "but I wasn't sure what I was building toward. Not until now." He unfolded a sheet of lined paper, margins filled with calculations, feed costs, lumber prices, market estimates. "I'd like to breed cavalry-grade stock," he continued, "sell to Fort Collins and maybe Fort Laramie. But it'll take infrastructure, fencing, additional hands, marketing." She scanned the notes, then looked up. "And you want me and this with you?" He didn't flinch. "I do." There was no romance in his tone, just purpose. But Margaret heard the affection beneath it, the trust, the open place he'd carved for her not out of necessity, but because he wanted her there. "I want to add a second classroom," she said. "Split ages, offer evening lessons. Literacy rates among the Swedish and German families are low, especially the girls." Caleb nodded. "You'd need supplies, benches, a new stove." "I'd need your support," she replied. "You have it," he said, without hesitation. They fell into quiet again, but this was not the silence of strangers. This was the shared pause of two minds working in tandem, building something real, something earned. Margaret reached for the ledger and picked up a pencil. "We'll need to revise the planting schedule, rotate the pasture to account for the foals." "I already made notes," he said, sliding another page forward. She read them, then smiled. "They're good. I learned from you." It wasn't flirtation, it was admiration. She leaned across the table, resting her hand atop his for a moment, not just to say thank you, but to say, "I'm here, and I'm staying." Sunday came wrapped in sunlight and stillness. The town chapel, whitewashed, simple, with its wooden steeple leaning ever so slightly to the right, stood as it always had, unchanging through weather and time. Inside, familiar faces filled the pews. Children squirmed, old men nodded, and the smell of beeswax and wood polish lingered in the air. Margaret and Caleb sat beside each other near the center, not holding hands, not displaying anything beyond what custom allowed, but something about their posture had shifted, closer, steadier. Not two separate lives in arrangement, but one life quietly unfolding. Reverend Harlan spoke of Ruth and Boaz that morning, of steady faith, daily loyalty, the kind of love that grew not in fireworks but in furrows, the kind of love that stayed. Margaret's gaze lingered on the wooden cross behind the pulpit, worn at the base where generations of hands had touched it in prayer. She wasn't one for grand declarations of faith, but something inside her whispered that this small chapel, this man beside her, this quiet road forward was providence at work. After the service, they remained behind as others filtered out. Elena gave Margaret a knowing glance before shepherding Maria into the sunshine. Miguel tipped his hat at Caleb but said nothing. There was no need. They stood in silence beneath the cross for a long minute. Then Caleb spoke, his voice low. "I used to think love was something loud, quick, maybe even painful." Margaret turned toward him. "But this," he continued, "this came quiet, like a prayer being answered before I even knew what I was asking for." She reached up, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wasn't expecting it either, but I think maybe God knew we both needed something we wouldn't have chosen on our own." He smiled, softly, reverently. "Not just love," she added, "but a place to plant it." Outside, the wind shifted, rustling the prairie grass beyond the chapel windows. It was still early in the season, still fragile, but the frost had broken. And in its place, something was growing. The chapel by the creek was never meant for grand sermons. It had no organ, no colored glass, no choir loft, just wooden pews, oil lamps, and a cross carved by hand, its edges smoothed by time and prayer. But on Thursday evenings it glowed. Catherine stood at the front, chalk in hand, her voice steady as she read a short passage from the book of Luke. Around her sat 7 women, some wives of ranch hands, others from the outskirts of town. Their hands were rough, their backs often sore, but their eyes were open, eager. She wasn't there to preach. She was there to teach them to read. The text was simple, familiar, but to Elena Santos, seated on the front bench with her fingers trembling slightly over the page, it was holy ground. "The Lord is my shepherd," Elena read aloud in halting English. Her voice cracked near the end, but she didn't stop. When she finished, the other women murmured quiet encouragement. Catherine didn't rush to praise. She simply placed a hand over Elena's and gave a small nod. That was enough. Later that night, as Catherine walked home with Miguel and Caleb, the stars were brilliant above them, silver and countless. The air smelled of cedar and dust. "She's never read scripture in English before," Miguel said, half in awe. "She did tonight," Catherine replied. "Not for me, for herself." Caleb was quiet beside her. But when they reached the gate, he offered her his arm, not as obligation, but as instinct, as habit made holy. The next morning, Catherine stood at the kitchen window, warm coffee in hand. Outside, Caleb and Miguel worked in the pasture, corralling a small herd with practiced ease. The sky was pale gold, the earth still soft from last night's rain. The image struck her like scripture, quiet, exact, deeply personal. "I belong here," she whispered, without realizing she'd spoken aloud. She did not belong to the land or the work or even to Caleb. She belonged to what they were building. That afternoon, as she stood before her class at the schoolhouse, chalking out multiplication on the board, she heard Caleb's voice from the back of the room. He was leaning on the doorway, hat in hand, watching the children work, watching her. She didn't need to ask what brought him, and he didn't need to speak what he felt. But as their eyes met, he gave her a look that answered a question she hadn't dared ask aloud. "This is what love looks like when it chooses you." The long table stretched across the ranch yard, flanked by benches handmade and mismatched chairs brought in from the bunkhouse, the chapel, even the schoolhouse. The sky overhead was a soft dusk blue, with the last traces of summer warmth lingering in the air. Elena had made tortillas. Martha brought apple cobbler. One of the German women, Frederica, carried in a cast-iron skillet of sausages that made the children cheer. Catherine had prepared a simple vegetable stew, the kind her mother once made in Boston, seasoned now with wild thyme from the prairie. They sat side by side, ranch hands, school children, mothers in Sunday shawls, elders with worn boots and wide memories. There was laughter in English, Spanish, Swedish. There were hands held briefly in prayer, each person speaking to God in their own tongue. And Caleb, sitting beside her with a girl on his knee and a boy clinging to his arm, leaned in and whispered, "This is what I never knew I needed." Catherine smiled. Later, as the sky deepened and lanterns were lit one by one, she stepped back from the gathering for a moment, just far enough to see it all. Elena was telling a story, her English now laced with confidence. Miguel stood behind her, nodding, grinning. Maria sat beside Margaret's youngest student, sharing a picture book. And Caleb? He was refilling coffee mugs, passing bread, and laughing in that quiet, shoulder-shaking way that she had come to love. It wasn't just a family. It was a home grown out of survival, made soft by grace. That night, in the quiet of their room, Catherine opened her journal one last time. The fire in the hearth had gone low, and Caleb's breathing had settled into the even rhythm of sleep. She dipped her pen in ink and wrote slowly, deliberately. "I came here because I had no place left to run. I stayed because I was seen. I built something because I was trusted. And I found love, not through thunder or flame, but through the steady, patient hand of mercy. This ranch, this land, these people have taught me that even in the harshest soil, God plants things we do not expect. Family, purpose, forgiveness, grace. I did not ask for these things, but they were given anyway." She closed the book and set it beside the lamp. Then, pulling the quilt to her chest, she whispered a single word into the quiet night. "Thank you." Not to Caleb, not to the sky, but to the one who had watched over her all along. And in the hush that followed, there was no need for more. If this story stirred something quiet in you, a memory, a longing, a light, don't miss our series Western Love Stories. Each tale unearths deep-rooted hope, grace, and love born from hardship. Subscribe and journey with us through windswept plains, quiet hearts, and the kind of love that heals.